Hi everyone, my name is Eric, and today I'm going to talk about how to give a good research presentation. Now, a lot of what I'm going to say, you could generalize to say any sort of technical presentation, and the tips might apply, but I think the key audience that I have in mind in this talk today is new researchers, or especially graduate students perhaps who are preparing for one of their first conferences, and hopefully this gives you some ideas of how to prepare for that. So, the first thing I would say is don't do this. So this is a trope that everybody uses, not everybody, but most people do. They start their talk by giving this outline slide and saying, I'm going to tell you about my motivation, our purposes, our methods. Everybody already knows that those are the key features of a technical talk. So it's not necessary to repeat it. It's a waste of time and it's a crutch and it's boring. Boring is the most important part here, but it's a crutch because I think in some ways it's just a way for some people to warm up to the talk. So if you feel like you need something to warm yourself up, you need to get past that because if you're giving a talk at a presentation where they've only given you 10 minutes, if you waste a whole minute on an outline slide like this or even 30 seconds, that time is much better spent actually talking about your topic. So my first point is no outline slide. Just jump right into what you actually want to talk about. So as an example, I'm showing you here, this is the first slide in the presentation I gave at my PhD thesis defense. So I haven't previously given an outline, I just jumped right in because my motivation when I started my PhD was an interest in this particular type of turbine device. So instead of some turbine which rotates, I was fascinated by this idea that you could have a wing that flaps up and down and still manages to extract energy from the flow. So I jumped right in, essentially where the actual story started. So this was my genuine motivation. And so it's important to just jump right in. And that brings me to the next point, which is that it should be a story. You should be telling a story. And the easiest way for it to be a story, to feel like a story, is to tell it as it actually happened. So there is a story here. If you're doing research and you're now presenting that research, you are a human at the center of that story as it happened. So you had an actual motivation, you had a reason, you had a general topic that you were interested in, and then there was a process that you took to get to a specific problem to solve. So tell that story as it happened. Now, of course, you only have minutes, not hours to tell the story, so you don't necessarily need to tell every bit of heartbreak that happened along the way, every dead end of research, but you can tell the key points and get the listener to follow you to the point where you actually get to your methods and your results, which, of course, as you progress in this story, it's going to get more and more technical if it's a technical talk. So tell a story. All right, the next point I'll make is that in telling your story, less is more. So I can think of two men who gave presentations while I was in graduate school who were finishing their master's theses, and I think of these as some of the two best thesis defense presentations that I've ever seen. And I actually was familiar with their work, so when I saw them present, it was clear to me that they were not telling me the whole story as in every bit of detail about the contributions that they made. So they managed to narrow it down, and they did this thoughtfully and consciously, and narrowed down their talk to one or two key takeaways. And that's important here because less is more. It's much more important to deliver well in an engaging way a story that gives the audience one key takeaway than it is to touch on six or seven key takeaways just to talk about how much you did in your thesis or how much work this project was. It's more important that there's a takeaway. And of course, then the story you work backwards in preparing from what the story is giving as a takeaway, and you decide what needs to be in the story to get you there. So less is more. Okay, the next point you've probably heard before, but I really want to emphasize you should have more pictures and less words. So this was really hammered home by my master's supervisor, and he hammered on us all the time. Anytime we had text on our slides, he would ask, "Why do you have this text?" Now, a common pushback that I've heard is that people need the text when they're presenting because that's sort of their cues. It's like their cue cards, so they remember what to talk about. But again, this is a sort of crutch because this is something that's for you, not for the audience. So instead of having all your cue cards on your slide, you can actually bring cue cards with you if you need to, or simply have it memorized. And of course, you also might be concerned about sharing this presentation with other people afterwards, people who could not actually attend the talk. And this is a pitfall where if you use only pictures and you share that PowerPoint afterwards, it might not mean a lot to someone who's looking at it. But of course, there are ways around this. If you're using PowerPoint, for example, you can make notes below the slides that don't appear in the actual presentation, and those would be available afterwards. So here, if we're looking at this slide here, this is the absolute nightmare worst case. I'm sure you've attended talks where people do this. They just have a huge block of text on a slide, and then they just read from it. Everybody knows this is a terrible way to do it. Slightly better is this. You have bullet points. But even this we can improve on. So I've made up a phonics study for the purpose here. And so you might have this slide and you might say, we investigated the psychological effects of hygiene practices involving water and foaming detergents on feline subjects. We sought to identify the onset of delusion as reported by the subjects themselves. As the subjects lacked the faculty of speech, telepathic communication was employed. Now, all of these points can be stated and can be much better summarized with this single image and this small little caption. So if this were a real study, I could have this image up the entire time I was talking about the methods. I could point at the foam and talk about the different detergents we use. I could talk about the different reports preliminarily that some of the subjects reported and how that I acquired these reports by means of telepathy. So, more pictures, less words. Ideally, you'll have almost no words at all. Now, on the next point, everyone has heard that you need to design your talk for your audience. That's a given. But I would argue in most cases, you need to broaden your audience beyond what you think it is. I think this is something, especially that new graduate students, I know I struggled with because you're new at it and you know there's lots of smart people and well-seasoned researchers in your audience, you assume that your audience knows more than they do. But in your particular topic, there's likely to be very few people who have as high a degree of familiarity as you do. And beyond that, there's always going to be people who are not experts who can gain something from this. I know in my experience, one of the most difficult talks that I ever prepared, but turned out to be one of the best, was my thesis defense. So I had family members there, I had my thesis advisors, I had the committee that was going to judge me, and I had my friends and lab mates who came to see the talk. So that's a very broad audience to try to talk to. And yet, I think by forcing myself to talk to that large of an audience, everyone had something that they could take away, and it was just a better and clearer presentation overall. And in general, don't worry about offending people if you explain something that someone in the audience already knows very well. For that small section of the audience that doesn't know it, that extra 10 seconds that you add is going to keep them engaged, and you're not going to offend the person who already knows it. So don't be afraid to broaden your audience to bring it as close as possible to the lay public as possible, even if it is at an academic conference. Okay, this last point is going to be relevant to you specifically if your research has a mathematical character, because it might be unavoidable that you're going to be presenting math. And math can be a very dry thing to present, a very difficult thing to present in an engaging way, and it may not be possible to simply show funny pictures to avoid the actual math. So if you have to show math, as you probably do, it's important to recall and think about the math as a language. So you are communicating something, especially if you're in an engineering or a physics-based field. You are explaining something that has relevance to the real world using mathematics. So talk about your math as if it is a language. So I have here in a presentation that I'm preparing, I have this equation that I'm going to need to talk about and talk about how I'm going to use it. To introduce it, I have this set of slides that I'm showing you now, and I'm going to give each of these different terms in the equation a name. And so I'm actually going to present it as this, where I highlight one at a time, I give it a name, and I talk about the physical significance of each one. So this will allow me to continue to talk about it later without having to show the equation every time. Once I've shown the equation for posterity and I've described its physical significance, I will only need to show the math again when I'm describing a particular mathematical operation. All right, let me sum up. So as I said before, pictures are important. So even in my conclusion slides, I have short little bullet points, and I usually try to have for each conclusion an image to reinforce the conclusion that I've made. So my first point was skip the outline slide. It's a total waste of time, it's boring, and it's a crutch. The second is tell a story, and that's most easy to do if you think of your research as a story. And in this story, you get to be the hero. So tell your own story. Less is more. Think about the takeaways that are most important, ideally one or two, and just include the content necessary to give those takeaways. Of course, more pictures, as much as possible. Show a picture instead of text to get your point across. People are there not to read, but to listen to you and to look at the visual aids that you have selected. Next, broaden your audience. So even if you're giving a technical talk to a mostly technical audience, there's a good chance that by delivering the material at as broad a level as possible, getting as close as possible to a level for the lay public, you are going to reach more people in the audience, and by nature, by doing that, you're going to make the talk more engaging. And lastly, if this is relevant to you, if you have to show math, remember to treat the math that you're showing as a language to describe something in the real world that is relevant to your audience. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you next time.